Let's get started here. I'm going to pull up my screen for you. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a lot today about how we collaborate with all students in the class to nurture an environment where all brains are recognized, all brains are expected in our classrooms. So when I talk about neurodiversity, I'm presuming that the classrooms that we teach in will be made up of many different types of brains. And we know lots of the labels that come with this. So I'm only going to point out a few that are on the screen. When I use the term neurotypical, I'm talking about brains that learn and process information in what has been positioned as the standard way, but of course we know it is not the only way. You'll recognize a lot of these labels: autistic, ADHD. One I want to point out is aphantasia. So one thing I've gotten really passionate about in the last few years is asking my students how they think and how they recall information. And there are people who don't have visual imaginations, so they're not able to see things in their mind's eye, which of course we don't think about a lot as teachers or professionals in schools. But it has an impact on what and how we teach, because we privilege visualizing as a strategy. It's an important skill for planning a future project, seeing imagining what it will look like. We use visualizing a lot in reading. So it's really important to know and gather insights from our students so that we can adjust and target the strategies that we teach them or use with them. So this is not an exhaustive list of different types of minds, but this presentation is really about how do we create classrooms where the things that we do are necessary for some, but they benefit everybody in the room. Because even within, under the umbrella of a label, there are no two brains which are identical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my classroom vision. I like to think of my classroom as a place where, from the outset, before students even set foot through the door, everyone is expected, they are planned for, and they are welcomed. And I've been thinking a lot about how can we shift away from the prevalent idea that it's only the students who access special education who learn differently, the ones who leave the room to go see someone else, and everyone else in our classrooms learn the same. Because that's not true. I want all students in my classroom to think about how they learn best and what things are easy for their brain, what's hard for their brain, diagnosis or not, and normalize the idea that there is no normal way to learn. So of course, I've been heavily influenced by some of my lived experiences. My brother Danny is autistic. I was told this when I was, 10 or 11, I think. He's a couple of years younger than me. And from the moment I learned that, I really took him under my wing. I saw how he struggled at school. I saw how teachers struggled to understand how his brain worked. He can't process a lot of information. So if you ask a question and repeat it too quickly, or ask another question, he shuts down. He can't process all of the information. And so his abilities were sometimes underestimated. And I would sit with him and work on homework, and I would be putting Mario and Luigi and other Nintendo characters into the math problems that he was working on as a hook to get him interested. And little did I know even then how much I was learning about good teaching from Danny, even before teaching was something I wanted to do. So that was part of my way of finding my way to teaching. After my undergraduate degree, I developed a drama program for autistic students. And when I was doing that, it was like that aha moment. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I have found my people. I just so enjoyed the perspectives and creativity and innovative ways of thinking my students had. And in a moment, I'm going to show you the best card I have ever received. I keep it in a special box. I pull it out every once in a while because it makes me chuckle. But that was the moment I decided that I wanted to pursue teaching. And unfortunately, that meant I had to leave the program that I'd been teaching to go and pursue that degree. And the students were encouraged by someone else, another teacher, to make me card. And the teacher was saying, when we make a card for someone, we want it to reflect the relationship that we have with that person. So she was coaching them, and I got a lot of cards that had drama masks or stages. And then she came up to this student, and she took one look and saw sort of how the message is disconnected from the art. And she said, "Does Miss Dymond like fire-breathing dragons?" And the student said, "No, but she likes good art." And he was absolutely right. I love the element of surprise in this card. I love that my home city of Toronto is on fire and in rubble, and the fire-breathing dragon. And I love how he marched to his own drummer. And it is a constant reminder that we always have to bend and see from our students' perspective. All art throughout this presentation, I should mention, is shared with student and parent permission as well. So a little bit about my background. I have a Master of Teaching degree. I've been teaching with a large urban school board since 2011. I earned my PhD and have been also lecturing at the University of Toronto in their education faculty since 2019. My first book came out a couple of years ago. I have a podcast, and like I mentioned, I have a book that I'm working on this topic I'm talking about today. Now, also noteworthy, I'm going to ask you to follow me on a tangent. This will not be the last time. There is a TED Talk, not one I've given, but it's called "Where Are the Baby Dinosaurs" by Jack Horner. And he is a paleontologist who puts forward the idea that whenever we find new big dinosaur bone fossils and it looks a little bit different than previously discovered fossils, the assumption is always it is a different kind of dinosaur. And he says we are missing the baby dinosaurs. Now, we have the inverse problem in the autistic community. We're pretty good at diagnosing certain subsects of the autistic community. Often it's middle-class white boys who are, about 8 years old. We're very good at younger people of that profile, but we miss a lot of adults. We miss a lot of marginalized community members, and I think about it in terms of we usually capture the stereotypes or the externalized presentations and miss a lot of the internalized presentations. And so I am one of those misclassified dinosaurs. I received my own autism and ADHD diagnosis in September 2021, which has been really, really a wonderful thing for me in a lot of ways, but that's a whole other talk. But it has given me the mindset that we do have to recognize needs in everyone. A lot of people go missed, of course, whether it's autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, just differences in how we process. For neurodivergent people, specifically autistic and ADHD, they are often masking all the time. And when I talk about masking, I'm talking about hiding authentic traits that they have to avoid embarrassment, to avoid feeling incapable, to avoid being discovered as the oddball or the weird one out. And those are very internal experiences that we have. And even our high flyers, sometimes we don't always think about this, but even the student who gets all the A's, hands things in on time, may need support. I always ask, what is driving them to do well? Is it fear? Are they a perfectionist? So many people hide what is hard for them, and that happens with a lot of our students too. So I always ask myself, how can I honor different ways of being and doing? And I ask myself these questions. Are the things that I'm asking neurodivergent friendly? So are they necessary, these expectations? Are they fair? Are they achievable by everyone? Or are there any other possible ways? And I want to talk a bit more about that internal experience. I had a student who was 12 years old, autistic, I would say likely gifted, really, really sophisticated way of speaking and thinking. And he told me that he hated the color red. And I did some investigating, asked him why. And he said when he was in kindergarten, he would come home every day with a communication log, and in it was a red frowny face. And he never knew what he had to do to get the green smiley face. So even 6 or 7 years later, this is having a profound impact on him. Many of our students don't know what the hidden expectations are. They don't know what they need to do. They can't read adult subtext. And so I will be talking about how do we make all these processes explicit so everyone has the information that they need. Now, I also use identity-first language when I talk about autistic students. There are certain labels that work better with person-first, but there are communities that prefer identity-first language. Like I said, autistic, deaf community. Often people who are disabled prefer to be called disabled people than a person with a disability. So language shapes our thinking. I usually ask people what they prefer. But for me, referring to myself as autistic is as natural as referring to myself as, someone who's really creative. I'm a creative person. I'm an autistic person. Autism shapes my experiences, how I think, how I feel, how I exist and relate to others in the world. And I say it proudly so that my students who are autistic don't feel shame when they hear the word. And this has been a big shift because in Teachers College, we are taught, use person first to honor the person first. But why are we okay with using identity first in some cases? Like we have no hesitation to say a gifted learner, but sometimes we shudder a little bit at using the term autistic. So autistic is not a dirty word, just a little food for thought. Now, there are issues with labels. When support is contingent on labels and access is restricted, not everyone has access, many people in our school systems and beyond go unidentified and unsupported. So labels have value for us in education as kind of a hypothesis of what might be difficult for a student, but ultimately students are our best resource. So I'm going to talk a little bit about difference makers. This is actually a picture. One of my students made a self-advocacy project about what it's like to be autistic. And I think this really captures some of the sensory and cognitive overload and the feeling of difference and just how much more exhausting school can be for someone who's processing a lot more information cognitively than other people are. So right from the outset, we can design our environment in ways supportive of all learners. So these are the common elements of an environment in which all learners can thrive, as I see it, and from a lot of the research that I've done. Predictability, having that safe environment, input and choice, positive adult rapport, self-regulation strategies, collaborative problem solving. These help everyone in the room. Now, later in this presentation, I'm going to tell you the two most powerful elements that I think are essential in the neurodivergent friendly classroom. So the first thing that I do, as I mentioned, I try to honor different ways of being and doing. Right in the beginning of the year, I begin talking about brains. I get students first to talk about what are their brain strengths? What are things that their brain makes easy for them? What are they maybe an expert in? How can they help other people in the room? Is there a subject that they're great at? Are they someone who's a good listener? We make an expert wall so that people know who they can approach for help. Then we also talk about our needs and what helps when something is hard. I really try to normalize the idea that we all need help. It's a strength to ask for help just as much as it is a strength to offer help. And I emphasized the process of learning. Perfectionism is such a hard thing to counter, and I find many students are perfectionists. They might not want to try something or even start something if they feel they can't do it. And I find teaching the process, building in feedback checks, framing, mistakes as learning opportunities, and also not being afraid as a teacher to make mistakes in front of the class, but to teach how we approach hard things and how those sort of feelings come up in all of us. Every once in a while, we all encounter a task where we go, oh, I don't know that I can do this. This feels really hard. But what do we have to do to get to the other side? And I also think about different ways of improving access. So one of the things that I really prioritize in my classroom is wait time when I ask a question, because I've found that we often privilege the fastest processors, those people who raise their hand the fastest. We take their answers all the time. And there are other students who maybe process the question or think a little bit more slowly or in a more nuanced way. They're grappling with more ideas, and it takes them a bit longer to formulate their answers. If I prepare my class that sometimes I will ask a question and I'm going to give them some time to think about it, or talk with a partner and then share the answer, and that I'm trying to encourage all types of processors in the room to answer. And I love seeing students who don't usually get selected have a chance to express an idea. I also use closed captions whenever I play videos. I'm sure you can think of many different ways of things you already do that improve access for all types of brains. When I talk about strengths and needs with the class, I also talk about my own. We make lists of, some difficulties that people might experience, and then what are the learning tools that they should be able to have access to. I have them chart their brains. What are their strengths, what things are they're okay at, what things are harder for them. And it gives me a sense of their self-awareness as well. And so I talk about my accessibility needs too. I try to do this to model problem solving. Anything that's hard for you, we can work together to find a way for you to access. You have the right to things that help you, whether you have a label or not. And I really want to destigmatize needing supports. Voice and choice is another important thing to bring into the classroom. I mean, we all know this. Students are more engaged and feel safer when they have some control in the environment, like we all do. Now, Stuart Shanker says that there's a difference between being and feeling safe. And both of those are important, but I think the more we listen to students, incorporate their ideas, show them that we've taken their preferences into account, we're helping them to not just be safe physically in our classroom, but to feel emotionally safe. So I have an art wall in the class, and we rotate art like a museum that they curate what they want to put up. I find different ways of soliciting feedback. So sometimes I have a page like this, you can see in the image, where I have sentence starters, and I tell them you can express yourself in words or in pictures or a mix of word and pictures. But it's a way that I can find out what they're thinking and what some of their anxieties are, and how I can teach them different things that maybe aren't necessarily specifically addressed in the curriculum, but I can help them with. I even have an anonymous questions bag if there's something that they want to learn or are curious about, but don't want other people to know that they've said it or are embarrassed to ask me directly. And I think making things predictable, again, that's one of those essential elements in the classroom. This helps so many learners. It helps learners who've experienced trauma, learners who have ADHD, LDs, and of course, autistic learners. Peter Vermeulen talks about autism as being a disorder prediction, that one of the hardest parts is being able to figure out and make like a predictive schema of what to expect. Instead, we tend to be like hyper vigilant processors, taking in all of the information, using up a lot of brain power, when other people have a really quick, rapid way of just having to process things that are different than what they expect. I want to give you an idea of what this feels like. So follow me on yet another tangent, and I'm going to show you 3 true news headlines. And I just want you to think about what kinds of thoughts and feelings come up for you, okay? So 2 arrested after fight over crab legs turns violent, police say. Man accused of tossing gator into Wendy's drive-through window. And I love you, but you owe me $127,000. New York aunt sues nephew 12, who broke her wrist at his 18th birthday party because she can no longer hold her plate of hors d'oeuvres. So what kind of emotional impact does that have? How does that make you feel when you read those headlines? It's absolutely baffling, right? It's hard to comprehend. Bizarre, exactly. Like, what were these people's motivations? What were their thought processes? You know, and then what would help to make these things make sense? How, like, I don't know if we can make sense of them, but what would help us? I mean, the only one I kind of understand is the fight over crab legs, because I've been to, a seafood buffet and I'm not afraid to use my elbows a little bit, but otherwise I'm completely just gobsmacked about what's going on here. I have great difficulty taking their perspective. And so I would need context. I would need more information. And this feeling of bafflement, I think, is something that if you happen to be neurotypical, you encounter every once in a while. But for many of our learners, especially our autistic learners, they experience this sense of bafflement every single day, multiple times a day, in every interaction with their teachers, with peers. They're doing so much to try and figure out the social world, the social information on top of the academics, which is why it's so important to have that predictable environment. Because, like I like to say, anxiety is the nemesis of learning. So we can expect that we don't always know what students are carrying into our classrooms with them, but they might have had a terrible day. They might be experiencing something horrible at home. We know that they come into our classrooms and they are not clean slates. They have lots of things impacting how they feel, how well regulated they are. And so I do some things environmentally to set us up for success. I have free access sensory tools once I have taught the difference between tool versus toy. And I don't introduce a whole bunch of tools at once, maybe just a couple. I do something called learning tool of the day or learning tool of the week as we move on. And this might be something like a coloring sheet that they can use while they're listening during the lesson, if it helps them listen. So how do I know that it helps them listen? They need to be able to answer when I call on them. What does it look like when it's not being used as a tool, when it's being used as a toy? If it's a squeeze ball, if it's a squeeze ball, the toy, it's being thrown, it's distracted. If it's a tool, it's just a subtle squeezing in their hand. And it helps them to listen. If it doesn't help them to listen or focus, not a good tool. I also try to introduce them to as many different self-regulation strategies as possible. So as a group, we do different stretching exercises, mindfulness activities. We even listen to different types of music or sounds during work periods. And I challenge students to think about what works for your brain. You might not like every activity that we do as a class, but I'm introducing you to many different tools so you can choose what works for you and ask for what works for you. And I think if there are any issues that you're having with, well, how do you take a break during a lesson or during a work period? You could talk to individual learners about and make a plan, what works for both of you. And just sometimes knowing that students can take a break and what that can look like helps to decrease that baseline anxiety that many of our students are walking in with already. And I also think about in my classroom design, having sensory refuges. So I have I call this the calming castle, but having a quiet place where they can work, or a spot where there's less visual clutter in the room that can be so distracting for our learners who process all the sensory stimuli. And sometimes even just having a little bit of downtime after transitions can help give our students the breaks that they may need. And removing the guesswork. So this is key to predictability. I sometimes say, if you were learning to drive and you got into the car with a coach, the driver instructor, and all they did was yell at you about what not to do, would you know how to drive? Like, not at all. It is so much more helpful to tell students what we want to see than to just tell them the mistakes that they're making. We want to give them the relevant information. So that's teaching them what we expect, giving them the reason why we expect that. A lot of our students really need the why to understand. And modeling out loud. This is a great way to build metacognition, is talking about, all right, I'm highlighting this part. Does anyone know why I highlighted this part? How do you find the main idea? What do we do as we read? What are the strategies that we use? You can model that and teach them, because not everyone walks into our room having learned those things. And many students need that explicit teaching. And it's going to help remind everyone of the strategies that we use. I also I don't make assumptions about what students know, so I do explain the obvious, but many students don't know it, so it really is not obvious to everyone. And I prime students. So before I wish to see a skill, I remind them of the skill. Before I play a video in the classroom, I will say, after the video, I'm going to ask you, whatever my question is, as a way of directing their attention so they know what to be thinking about as we watch the video. I also do, as I mentioned, tool of the day or week, and I teach them different options. I challenge even my graduate students I do this with, where I will challenge them to, all right, instead of you're very comfortable with written responses, why don't you record me an audio response? Let's see how they can organize ideas verbally. I've taught students Google Read and Write, because students of all ages, because I've had students who say they'll read something and immediately forget or don't remember what they've read. And I've taught them that sometimes if you hear text and read along, you're having it enter two channels, you will remember the details better. And I've had students come back to me and say, like, it transformed their graduate experience because they were struggling with reading and wasting a lot of time. Like I mentioned, we test out different background noises during work periods. Brown noise is amazing for my brain. Gray noise, pink noise, nature sounds, whatever it is. I teach them how to take breaks and alternate breaks between work periods. You can find a lot of information on the Pomodoro technique, and different fonts and things, even different paper textures can make a difference for instance, dyslexic learners. Now, one of the coolest things that has come out as a tool in the last year or two is called bionic reading. So I'm going to show you this. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just normal font, okay? This is bionic reading, and you may have a strong reaction to it, but this works so well for my brain. Doesn't work for every brain, but that's why we tell the whole class and let them see what works for them. So as you can see, this bolds the beginning of each word, which allows the brain to kind of track as someone is reading. I'm a speed reader, and sometimes I might miss the meaning because I read so fast. This actually, I can still read really fast, but I'm taking in each of the words because of the novelty of the bolded text. And I build in exit tickets or learning logs either each day or every week, depending on the subject. It works for your brain too, cool. So beginning of the year, I might ask questions like, how do you prefer to absorb information? Like how does information best stick in your brain? Do you like to listen? Can you absorb auditory information, watching, doing, reading? What helps you when you're stuck on a different question? Or what strategies do you use to feel calm and ready to learn? Those kind of tell me whether students already have an inkling of how to self-coach, if they already know some things that they do to be ready to learn. And I'll ask them about environmental things that help them. What makes a work period easier to get work done in? Do you like the tool of the day? Would you use it? Why or why not? So I'm constantly collecting information and challenging them to think or write down a little bit about what they're learning about their learning. Of course, communication is essential in our classroom, how we communicate with students. There's a very fascinating concept. This is from an autistic researcher, Dymond Milton, and it's called the double empathy problem. And although he uses it in the context of a neurotypical person talking with an autistic person, it applies to every interaction with every type of brain. It's basically the idea that if there's ever a breakdown in communication, it takes two to tango. If it's a neurotypical and an autistic person, if there's any sort of breakdown, usually both people blame the autistic person, because neurotypical people aren't really that accustomed to communication breakdowns, because the majority of people that they communicate with share the same communication style. The autistic person is less used to talking to people who share their style of communication. So they're more likely to have those breakdowns just because they're talking to someone who processes very differently most of the time. Now, Crompton and colleagues did this amazing study that I just love that looked at this double empathy problem. It's basically like that game of broken telephone where you pass a message down a chain of people, and they had 3 groups. They had a fully autistic group, a fully non-autistic group, and then a mixed chain where one person's non-autistic and then autistic and so on. And each of these groups had to rate the rapport that they felt with one another. And also they tracked how many details were correctly remembered. And what's interesting is the fully autistic group, fully non-autistic group had the same outcomes essentially. They rated relatively high rapport. They remembered a similar level of detail. The mixed group completely fell apart. And this is a good reminder that it's not an autistic inability to communicate, but it is a mismatch in communication styles. Neurotypical people do have communication breakdowns, but I will definitely argue that autistic people experience them very, very regularly, even more so, and tend to internalize a great deal of shame around them. And so as teachers, we do have to adjust how we communicate. And it's kind of a given. We know how to do this for other types of learners sometimes. You wouldn't expect a student with a visual impairment to follow instructions written on the blackboard, or a student who's hard of hearing to have to process auditory instructions. We would make some changes to what we do. It can be really hard with invisible disabilities to understand what they need. But we also have to make some tweaks. And that's why I say students are our best resource. When we get curious about their experiences, they can help us figure out what works best for their brains. One thing I hear over and over from students, they really appreciate when teachers are predictable, when they know they can approach them with a problem and they're not going to get yelled at. This is particularly important for autistic students with ADHD or sensory processing. Yelling can feel excessively painful. And one thing my students always ask me to pass on, my autistic students, many autistics can't look and listen at the same time and process what is being said. So demanding eye contact might mean they are missing what you are saying. So considering how are they able to absorb your message, and asking them. Wording, how we communicate, the words that we use also matter. We tend to speak and use a lot of figurative language, but more literal processors will struggle with that. I had a student who was in grade 7. She was accepted into a gifted program, so very high cognition, but still struggled with understanding idioms. And she told me that when she heard an expression that she hadn't heard before, she would try and remember it so she could go home and Google it later. Now, just imagine if that's taking up all of her working memory, how much is she missing after that expression? Like, she's going to miss parts of the learning because her attention is going towards what on earth are these people meaning? That experience of bafflement I was talking about earlier. So being very clear, saying precisely what we mean, builds trust and ease. Sarcasm can be very, very difficult, especially if a person is deadpan, too many words, speaking way too fast. I know I'm speaking a little fast, but also being specific. A lot of neurodivergent learners really value precision, and they are going to answer exactly the question that you ask. And I have learned this in many cases the hard way. So we do have to be open to different interpretations. So I've asked this on one of those 4 square sheets I showed you earlier. As an adult, I want to be, I've gotten some answers I expected, a doctor, a boss, single. And you know what? That student answered my question. I didn't say, what career might you go into? So I wasn't specific, which meant I had to be open to different interpretations of the question I was asking. So I now always review my questions and I try and think, are there any pitfalls that they might experience with the questions that I'm asking? So I try to avoid questions they can overthink, and these tend to fall into 2 categories. Too precise. So this question is difficult. What is your favorite winter game? This stumped this student because he was really deliberating, like, what is my favorite as if I was going to hold him to it. So once I changed the wording to what is one winter recess game you enjoy, it was not difficult for the student to answer. Too open-ended is also problematic or ambiguous in some way. Sometimes teachers will give an assignment in September to write about their summer. And our students who are neurodivergent may overthink this like it's an existential crisis. Like, oh my gosh, do I have to tell everything that happened in my entire summer? They might give up and not write anything down at all because it's too open-ended. Or they might hand in like 30 pages and they have exhausted themselves by telling you like the minutia of their entire summer because they don't know what you're looking for. And perhaps changing the question to something like describe one highlight of your summer, or one thing that you learned over the summer, just making it a bit more specific is going to help them to figure out what you are looking for. Our students also often have trouble with long, wordy instructions, big blocks of text, especially if it asks multiple questions in that block. It might be better to break it down and actually visually space it a little bit differently because how it looks really matters. You want to clear clutter where you can, even on worksheets, reduce the number of questions on a page or increase the font, and just help them prioritize questions so that they're tackling things in small bits can really help. And visuals, I mean, we know this, we know visuals aid comprehension. They convey information so much more quickly than words. It reduces cognitive load, it leads to faster processing, and it frees up that working memory that can be limited in some students. And I'm reminded of this all the time. A couple of years ago, I had a student come to my classroom and he said, over the weekend, I played billiards or pool. And one of the other students didn't know what it was. And so the first student and I tried to describe the game of pool. We used a meter stick as if it were a pool cue. We described the green felt table and the deep pockets and the game mechanics. The next week, I brought in a mini billiard set for them to use at indoor recess. And the student who didn't know what pool was said, oh, that's what you were talking about. Miss Dymond, you should have shown a picture. And she was absolutely right. That would have allowed the student to access the comment rather than us trying to act it out and use a lot of words. So I build in exit tickets throughout the year too, or a learning log where they reflect each week and answer a couple of questions. So I might ask them, what does comfortable listening look like or feel like for them? How do they feel most comfortable participating in class? How they feel most comfortable communicating with me when they need help. They might not be confident enough to raise their hand or come to the front. They might need to put a little post-it in the corner of their desk and I have to kind of be alert and come over and ask if they need help as a step towards greater autonomy and self-advocacy. And I'll even ask them about like what throws them on a test, what's harder. I always struggled with multiple choice and true or false, not because I couldn't find what was presumably the correct answer, but I worried that they were trying to trick me. And I would spend time writing a full sentence about why I chose the answer I did, which of course is taking away time from everything else. But I have that need for precision, as many of my autistic, brethren do. So even with tasks, I spend some time thinking about how do we build in the power of self-monitoring or student insights. I often have students at the beginning of the year, they might ask me questions like, am I doing good? And I say, what do you think? I don't want them to be looking to me for approval all of the time. I will definitely give them positive reinforcement at times, but I want them to develop trust in their own opinion and their ability to self-assess themselves. So I know I alluded before to the two most powerful elements that I think can come together in the classroom like an unstoppable force, kind of like Godzilla with a lightsaber. And this, what I'm talking about, is the combined power of teacher and student self-reflection. So with teacher self-reflection, these are some of the ways I embed it. I backwards plan. So that means when I'm thinking about what are the overarching goals for this particular unit or area of curriculum, what ultimately do I want them to be able to do? And then I think about what are the sub skills that might need to be taught explicitly for them to be able to do that. And I consider things like how to sustain attention, how to plan and prioritize. I break it down by executive functioning skills and other skills that I think are needed. I think about what's comfortable for students and how do they express their knowledge best? And what are we really assessing? For instance, am I assessing in this task the mechanics of writing, or am I actually assessing how they can express their ideas? And if it's the latter, can they record an audio note? Can they express it in a different way than physically writing? Can they do it orally? And often I'll ask students what they prefer. So flexible products are really helpful. Sometimes you'll find out something really interesting about a learner. I had a student who was given a task to write a diary for a social studies unit. And they said, I can't write first person for someone else. I could write a third person perspective story that still gets across that I understand the history and feelings and all of these things. And so sometimes just talking to problem solve, how can you meet the criteria, but do it in a way that benefits your brain? You can come up with some very interesting solutions. And it's so much more interesting as a teacher not to have the same thing over and over again. So it helps us to make targeted choices. As for inferences, someone's asking about that in the chat. Again, using that talk out loud strategy. So if you're reading out loud with the class, you can talk about how do we make meaning of what we're reading? How do you know what this character is feeling? What were some of the clues from the text? You want to teach them what to look for, because not all brains know how to hone in on what's important, because again, there are lots of brains in the classroom that are sustaining attention in other places. I have students set their own goals throughout the school year, and then I conference with them. And I use this time to coach them. What's easy about the goal? What's still hard about the goal? What do you think would help you? What can I do? What do you think you could do? What can we try out until our next conference review? And I thank them a lot for the strategies that they develop or we develop together, because I'll say, this can help me help other students who are also working on similar goals. We debrief as a group different experiences, whether it's how did that session of group work go? What did you do well? What's a goal for next time? What's something that we can work on for next time? And I have them do report card self-assessments where they tell me things like, this is an end of the year assessment. I had her talk about her personal goals. And she said she felt that she improved on taking better care of herself, remembering to keep herself in a positive mental state. At the beginning of the year, participation was hard for her, but she's gotten better with participating and she's proud of that. And at home, she's gotten better at asking for help. So these insights are really important. And I think we develop a lot of skills and the language that children need to self-advocate by explicitly asking these questions. And then if you have a student who is maybe not as expressive when you conference, you can have them, type their answers and you sit and talk with them and they type. Or during the online learning period, I created a Jamboard with a student who wasn't as expressive about his needs. And I just had him underline what statements he thought were true for him. And I used that hypothesis, my sort of detective skills, things that I thought might be a barrier for him. And then I wanted to see, what he would think. And this gave me some insights into his working memory capacity, which then gave me better strategies to teach the student. So there's lots of creative ways to find out those things. Now, executive functioning skills, this is not the exclusive list of executive functioning skills on the screen, but I teach students about many different executive functioning skills. And then we talk about workarounds that they can use if they struggle with the skill. And again, it's like normalizing all ways of being. And then we break down executive functioning skills in tasks and activities. I even had a student come and share that he defeated a video game. Finally, he'd been trying to do this for a long time. And so I asked him, what executive functioning skills do you think that you used? Wow, you were really amazing at sustaining attention in this context. So I'm giving them the language. And then even if they're having a difficult time, you have a student who rushes to be front of the line. we can then talk about, yeah, it can be really difficult to manage emotional response or to inhibit a response sometimes, isn't it? Those are things I can support you with. So another executive functioning skill I've talked a little bit about is working memory capacity. People have working capacities in different amounts. Apparently, on average, it's about 4 pieces of information new pieces of information you can keep in your brain and use and manipulate, and then before it falls out of your brain. But again, people have capacities that vary. You might have a student who can only remember the first and the last thing that you said, or the first 2 things, or none of the things that you've said. And so I'll teach students that if you have a working capacity that is smaller, you can externalize information. So writing things down helps you not have to keep it here, or having it written down for you. Or students with working memory capacity limitations can't always take notes and listen because that takes up so much working memory. But I'll ask them about, like, how can you use your interests, which taps into your long-term memory, in one of the subjects we're learning. Like we just explicitly talk about all of these concepts. I don't love tests, but I know that schools use tests a lot. So we talk about study skills. What executive functioning skills do you need when you study? We talk about the power of retrieval. We actually learn more deeply. It gets into our long-term memory when we practice recalling information without looking at the source. That's how it gets deeply learned. If we just read over our notes all the time, we think we're prepared, and then we come to the test and it falls out of our brains. So we talk about retrieval strategies. We make collaborative study guides. What do you think is important? What do you think the teacher thinks is important? It really helps to direct their attention and prioritize and all of those things. And I also teach them what to do before a test, during a test, sort of to manage anxiety and strategies to approach the test. And then afterwards, what do we do? The learning isn't over just because you get a mark back. What do we do to maximize learning from all parts of the process? And organizing ideas. Many students have difficulty. They have so many ideas and it's hard to distill them. So we'll practice. We'll have a mini lesson on how do you mind map. Or I'll teach them to write a whole bunch of ideas on Post-its and then sequence them. Or go between mind mapping about an essay topic and then just sort of free form stream of conscious writing. No one's going to see it. Spelling mistakes are okay. Just keep writing until I say stop for a few minutes. Mind map again. See if anything has been clarified. Go back and forth a few times. And these are really important anchors, external anchors, especially for those students who do not visualize as easily or at all. They're going to learn more from external information, from repetition, from procedural, doing type of tasks. And this will reduce some of that working memory load when you've already taken the ideas and they're out of their head. And we talk about sustained attention and some of the things that get in the way, how sensory can be difficult. No one notices everything all the time. So we all focus on something at the exclusion of the other. I don't know if you've ever seen the video where there's a basketball team playing, you're supposed to count how many passes, and then they have someone dressed as a gorilla or a bear who dances through the middle. If you're focused on the task you're told to focus on, you don't see the dancing bear. But you might see the dancing bear, but then you've missed the task. And that happens all the time in our classrooms where students are attending to different things. So we talk about that. We talk about, for learners, for instance, autistic and ADHD learners have interest-based attention systems. It is really easy to activate or hyper-focus when it's of interest. But when it is not of interest or when it's hard, the brain does not release the neurochemicals that make it easy to shift and pay attention. In fact, the brain actually sends pain signals. So it's doubly difficult compared to a neurotypical learner. And so I teach them, like, how do we inject interest to things? How do we inject challenge? Because sometimes our brains are activated by challenge. How do we inject dopamine hacks or happiness hacks? These are all things that make it easier for the brain to transition, whether you're listening to music you like, or here's an example of injecting challenge. I am one of those adults who hates doing dishes. I do them because I also hate messy houses. but I will sometimes have difficulty getting started. So I have developed a technique where I will boil water in a kettle to make tea. And I'll just think to myself, you know what, let's just see how many dishes I can wash while I wait for the kettle to boil. Yeah, you do the same thing, that's great. And then once I start the task, I can get through it. It's just literally getting over that hurdle to get started. So that's my little trick to get started. But we could teach students different ways of injecting challenge. How can they hack their attention systems? And interests, I mean, we all know interests are important for inclusion, for engagement, but they help with long-term memory. They help with increasing working memory capacity. Interests improve reading comprehension and expressive language. Often students will do so much more work if they have a choice or are able to somehow link a project to their interests. And so I'll ask students, like, how do you think we can relate your interests? Is there a skill that can make this project more interesting? Maybe you don't love the topic, but you want to teach yourself animation. So maybe you can make a video. And okay, note taking, like I said, it's a way of sustaining attention for some, but not people who have more limited working memory capacity. We talk about, again, how do we take notes? How do we do these things? The executive functioning skills, prioritizing, working memory, sustained attention. With older groups, I will teach them to do like a shared Google Doc where we give people roles. You are looking for the dates. You are looking for the important people. You are looking for the important events, and you're going to add this to the Google Doc. You can provide different levels of organizers for different types of processors. I actually have a blog post on my website about, you know, how can you do fill in the blank notes for those who can't keep all the information in mind, versus something with a little bit less support, versus a system where I teach students in history class how to code in the margins. So they come up with a little legend. So, you know, they might have a C for concept. I teach them like E for an event, but they can come up with whatever works for them. And as those important details come up, they code them after the lesson in their notes. They can even put little smiley faces or emojis to convey how did people react to these particular events. And I find it's a great way of directing attention to what's important and can then be used to prioritize for studying. And of course, those are other skills, executive functioning skills. So the chunk and check-in, we break down projects together into a full to-do list, including all of the hidden expectations we often don't include in our assignment guidelines. Like, you know what, have plan time to read and edit and practice. Like, what are all the skills we expect them to do? And some students are fine to have a big list like this of each of the steps. Some I might cut this into strips and say, here are today's tasks, here are tomorrow's. But ultimately, I eventually want them to break things down into like, what's the next smallest step? But I want to show them that when a teacher assigns something, we don't expect you to do it all the night before. We actually expect you to do a little bit and manage your time over the whole period. And even group work, I think about this as structured socializing, and I ask myself, like, who needs help finding a group? Do they know what to do in a group? Is there a way they can shine? Does the group know how to solve problems? And I'll teach many lessons on different topics, like how do you divide the work? What do you think you can do if everyone has different ideas? How do we include all the voices? And I'm building students' language skills. I'm building their problem solving skills by having these ongoing discussions. And again, so I'll have them think about on an ongoing basis, what was hard for your brain? What was easy for your brain? What do you think will help you when something's hard? What do you want to celebrate about your growth? What are your goals for next week? What executive functioning skill is like a challenge for you at the moment and that I can help support? So all sorts of questions related to what I'm teaching them. And it helps me to really make compassionate assumptions. I have a detective mindset about students. I use Ross Greene's Plan B approach to get curious about why is something hard for a child and to work with them to come up with solutions they think might work. And often that means I might have to change something in the environment or something that I'm doing to be more supportive, but they also learn things that they can do through our conversations. And so I want to leave you with a story. So I had a student that when I first started teaching him, I took over from a previous teacher who he'd had for a couple of years. he was really reluctant to like me because I had taken over from this teacher. And one day I happened to hear him talking about how he wanted to go rock climbing. And I went, I wonder if we can go on a class trip and go rock climbing. And so I investigated, I got approvals. And the next week I came back and I said, guess what? Our class is going to go rock climbing. And I will never forget this because he looked up at me and he said, no one's ever listened to me before. And I got chills. I still get teary thinking about it because our relationship shifted from that moment. Like, we know we need to listen to students, but that was such a visceral moment for me to realize many of our students don't feel like they have any say or that their voice is important. And it's incumbent upon us as teachers to do that. So that, oh yeah, I'll show you. That's the rock climbing. So I'm going to leave you with 3 questions because I often think about how we think of our role in education, the role of students, influences what happens in our room. So what is one small change you can make to what you're already doing well? How can you make your classroom a microcosm of the world as you wish it to be? And how are you going to plant seeds for a kinder, more comfortable world for everyone? So thank you for sharing in this work. I think we have about 2 minutes for questions. Here's some ways you can get in contact with me if you have questions later or just want to engage. I'm always happy to work in partnership, collaborate, send a few messages or emails back and forth.
Awesome. What a great presentation, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you really enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm sharing here the link for her website. You will have access to the replay and to the slides after the show. I could not thank you enough, Kara, for this amazing presentation. It was spot on. It was practical. It was real. It was not only theoretical, it was real life stuff. It was really, really great. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We will have to leave this webinar to go for the launch time for us and our launch presentation. Thank you so much, Kara. We really appreciate you. I leave you say your last word to the crowd, and I will say goodbye to everyone right after. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining me in this work. You know, what we do is so important, and sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and that's okay. We are also learners. I say to my students all the time, we're all works in progress, and we are all growing and setting goals. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. So I will see you later on today. Thank you once again, Kara, Dymond, for your amazing presentation. We will send you the answer from the form. I'm pretty sure you're going to have amazing comments in there.
I appreciate it.
Have a great lunch, everyone. Thank you, Kara. See you in the next webinar.